Today we're talking about Thomas Reid and his view of personal identity. If you want to understand Thomas Reid, you got to understand that everything he wrote was a reaction against David Hume. He read David Hume, fellow Scot, and thought this guy is brilliant, but all of his views are crazy. And what we need is to cure him of his philosophical skepticism with a heavy dose of common sense. So, David Hume says, when the philosophers ask the question, am I the same person today as I was yesterday? What's the man of common sense going to say? The man of common sense is going to say, are you kidding me? Of course I am. So Reid starts out his essay by saying, we know by common sense that our self, our personal identity, reaches as far back as our memory. Am I the same person who, graduated from high school last year? Of course I am. I remember it. There's no question. He's the conviction which every man has of his identity, as far back as his memory reaches, needs no aid of philosophy to strengthen it. He goes on to say that actually no philosophy could possibly weaken that belief without first producing some degree of insanity. So you're crazy if you even doubt that. So that's his starting point. But at this point, you might be thinking, well, what about David Hume's arguments? I mean, Hume said that we never actually observe the self. When I introspect and I try to find a self that's having my perceptions and impressions and stuff, I never find it. So that means I don't even have an idea of what we're talking about. How am I supposed to know by common sense that my self exists, is identical through time? I don't even have an impression of it. I've never even seen it. I have no idea what I'm even talking about. Thomas Reid says, look, we can know that we have a self. We actually have a pretty good idea of ourself without ever having directly observed it or having had an impression of it. In other words, he just denies Hume's claim that you have to have an impression of something in order to be able to have an idea of it. It's just not true. I know that I am an identical self through time, even though I had no impression of myself, no direct kind of perception of myself, no impression, no problem. Well, what about David Hume's argument that all I am is just a stream of consciousness, a stream of thoughts, and there's nothing the same about me from one moment to the next? Here's how Hume argued. Hume said, look, our perceptions and our pains and pleasures and thoughts and all that stuff, they belong to the mind in the same way as drops of water belong to a river. Those are its parts. That's what makes up who I am. But our perceptions and thoughts change constantly. So that means that the parts of myself are changing constantly. If something changes its parts, it becomes a different thing. It's not perfectly identical with itself anymore. And that means, says David Hume, that ourselves perish and begin as rapidly as their perceptions change. Every instant, I'm a new person. That was Hume's line of thought. What's Thomas Reid going to say to that? I mean, come on, Thomas Reid. Don't you know that my thoughts and perceptions and stuff change all the time, every minute? Here's Reid's answer. Reid agrees that if something changes its parts, it becomes a different thing. It's not perfectly identical with itself anymore. He agrees with Hume's high bar, his high identity criterion. He disagrees with this first premise, that my perceptions and pains and pleasures and thoughts belong to me as my part. He says, look, perceptions and so forth don't belong to my mind as parts of a whole. They belong to the mind in the way that dance moves belong to Beyonce. They're actions which she does, not parts of her. So that means that the mind can perform successive actions. It can have successive thoughts and perceptions and feelings and so forth without ever acquiring or losing any parts or properties. To have a feeling is to perform an action, not to acquire some new part. That's Thomas Reid. So it's just not true that my parts are changing all the time. In fact, he says, we know by common sense, everybody knows, that persons don't have parts. Persons are indivisible. Here's what Reid says. When a man loses his estate, or his health, or his strength, he's still the same person and has lost nothing of his personality. If he has a leg or an arm cut off, he's the same person as he was before. The amputated member is no part of his person. Otherwise, the amputated arm would have a right to part of his estate and be liable to part of his engagements. Like the arm would owe part of his debts. He would be entitled to a share of his merit and demerit. We would have to give the arm, the detached arm, partial blame for bad stuff that the guy did or something like that, which is manifestly absurd. That means that your arms and legs aren't actually part of your person. They're not part of yourself. The self is indivisible. It's not composed of parts. And that means that the self cannot change. Unlike David Hume, who said that the self is changing constantly, its parts and characteristics, Reid says, no. If something is not divisible into parts, then it cannot change because it can't lose or acquire a new part. It can't lose or acquire characteristics. It's common sense that a person cannot be divided or consist of parts. We just talked about that. And therefore it follows, by modus ponens, a person cannot change. People are unchangeable. Now, here's another consequence that follows from this. This kind of brings us back to where we started, the end of our dualism conversation. This leads to an argument for dualism, which he gives in a text which is part of the text which is not included in your book, I don't think. He says, look, persons are indivisible and unchangeable. The physical bodies are divisible and they are changeable, right? You can lose your arm and so forth. Therefore, it follows from this that persons are not bodies. And if what your self is not your body, then that means you got an immaterial self, like a traditional soul. Dualism. So he says, well, what about bodies, though? What about physical objects? We've been talking a lot about trees and animals and objects. That should be trees, not trees. In any case, are they identical through change? He says, no, they don't have perfect identity. They have what you might call imperfect identity, which is sort of ish. We call them the same thing. They don't really have perfect identity. This imperfect identity comes in degrees. It admits of great change. It's compatible with great change in the subject, providing that the change be gradual, and sometimes even of a total change, say of your parts. So, animals change out their cells. The organisms change out their cells every 7 years. Yeah, it's the organism might have imperfect identity. It doesn't have perfect identity, but we still call it the same thing, and we talk about it as if it were the same thing. Trees, they grow from acorns to oak trees. Yeah, we call it the same thing. It's got imperfect identity. It doesn't have perfect identity, though. It's strictly speaking, bodies like that don't have perfect identity. Or say regiments. He gives this example too, like a military regiment. You might say 100 years ago, 26th Regiment conquered this hill. And here we are today. The regiment's still with us. Because all the soldiers from 100 years ago are dead. Is it the same regiment? Sort of, kind of, imperfect identity. But that's not a high enough bar for personal identity. Persons have perfect identity. Physical objects, no. They just have imperfect identity. Now, how do I know that I am the same person that I remember in the past? How do I know that I do have personal identity through time? And he says memory is evidence for our personal identity. I remember my past actions and experiences. That's not the only evidence I have, though, for my past existence, my identical existence. There's some stuff that I don't remember, but that other people tell me happened and that I did and experienced. So, my mom tells me that I was born on this day, and here's what the day was like. And, here's the first word I said. I don't remember that stuff, but she tells me I did it. And that's good evidence that, yeah, I did. I must have existed back then and done those things, had that experience. What that means is, even though Reid relies on memory, he's actually rejecting Locke's view. Locke said, you are only identical with a person to the extent that you can remember their actions and experiences. It's the memory, according to Locke, it's the memory that makes you identical with that past person. But Reid says it's not my remembering action of mine that makes me to be the person who did it. Memory just plays the role of providing evidence that I am a person who did this thing back then. And it's not even the only evidence that there is. In fact, he brings up an important objection, a refutation, which most people take to be decisive, to Locke's memory view of personal identity. The counterexample is the brave officer paradox. So he tells this story. You imagine a brave officer, okay? When he was a boy, a schoolboy, he was beaten by his teacher. When he got a little bit older and he was a young man, he was a soldier, he took the standard, he took the flag from the enemy in his first campaign. And then when he got much older, he became a general. Now, when he became a general, he could, well, let me back up. When he was a young man on his first campaign, he could remember being beaten as a schoolboy. And when he became an old general, he could remember taking the standard from the enemy. But he couldn't remember being flogged as a schoolboy. So here's the problem that then raises for Locke's view. Okay, this example. So here's the brave officer in 3 stages of his life. First, when he was flogged as a schoolboy. Second, when he took the standard from the enemy. And third, when he was made a general. According to Locke's view, brave officer 1 is identical with brave officer 2 because the young man could remember being beaten as a schoolboy. If you can remember something, you are that person. And on Locke's view, brave officer 2 is identical to brave officer 3 because, again, 3 can remember what 2 did. But it should follow from that if 1 equals 2 and 2 equals 3, it should follow that 1 equals 3, that the schoolboy is identical with the general. But on Locke's view, that's not true because the old general cannot remember being flogged as a schoolboy. If you can't remember that person, you're not that person. So that's an absurd result because 1 should equal 3, but it doesn't on Locke's view. So Locke's view is false, says Thomas Reid and most other people. But maybe you got a good answer to it. You want to defend Locke, that's fine. So what we've done now is we've seen that memory and testimony can provide evidence for that we are the same person as that we were yesterday or 10 years ago or what have you. What about other persons? How do I know that, say, my wife is the same person today as she was yesterday, or the one that I married so many years ago? Well, and how do I know that, like, the tree outside my window is the same one that I saw out there yesterday? In other words, what's the evidence for the identity of other persons and of objects of sense? And he says the evidence that you have is their similarity. Now, this is different than memory. He says wherever we observe a great similarity, we are apt to presume identity if there's no reason to the contrary, if no reason appears to the contrary. Right? So if the tree out there now looks like the one I saw yesterday, and I don't see any big differences, I have every reason to think it's the same thing. If my wife looks the same now as she did yesterday, or the day we got married, if she looks, virtually identical, then I have every reason to think, we naturally think, it's the same person. So that's how we re-identify other objects which are identical. If they don't, yeah. So that may raise questions, though. Here's one question I have about this. Take, for example, the case of persons. So on Reid's view, Reid's a dualist. Persons are not their bodies. That means I don't observe them directly. I can't see whether they are similar, right? So I might be able to observe, this person had brown hair yesterday and they have brown hair today. That's great, but they're not their hair, their bodies. So it seems like at most I can observe the similarity of the organism associated with the person. But that doesn't give me an argument for the claim that there is a person in each organism, or that similar organisms contain similar persons. There's a difference between the person and the body. Now, here's what Reid, I don't know what he says, but you might want to say, look, you don't need an argument. If a person looks physically similar, the same person, immaterial soul person, is inside there. That's all common sense. Maybe so, maybe not. Something to think about. There's a lot here to think about. Keep at it.